Welcome. Hello, everyone. I'm Pia Renada. Welcome to Rappler Talk Newsmaker. Our guest today is Father Jett Villarin, who is the Executive Director of the Manila Observatory, and their topic is of transcendental importance. It's about the latest United Nations climate change report, which was released last August 9, Monday. And it's our topic today because it's a very alarming report. It's a major report that details the effects of climate change for years to come, and also the fact that we've already reached that the humanity has led to a 1.1 degree Celsius warming of the Earth, and what this means for humanity, the effects that we will have to live with for the next years and decades to come. So, welcome, Father Jett. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Pia. I'm glad to see you again after so many years.
Likewise.
And a good afternoon to all our viewers.
So, Father Jett, this report nga, no, it's really alarming. When I first read it a few days ago, the first thing that came to my mind was what would happen to my daughter's future, right? Like, we're talking about even just 10 years from now, the fact that we're locked in for serious devastation, like more frequent heat waves, more deadly flooding, more droughts. I mean, it's scary just reading it and imagining what this means for everyone. And even if this is not, politics is not a sexy topic, right? It's actually the topic that will determine the fate of more than just even elections. I mean, it's the fate of the entire world. So, siguro we can start off with that. No? Maybe you can explain, Father Jett, what the report is. It's called the Sixth Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. To most people, this is just jargon. Can you explain to us what this report means to humanity? What is inside the report?
Okay. Well, how do I begin this? The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, comes up with these periodic reports. This is the sixth edition, so to speak. And what we can glean from the latest report is that there is greater confidence in what we've been saying all along. Now, this is important because in the past, the doubters, the skeptics, have latched on to some uncertainties. And we were not really certain about some of these pronouncements. But over time, there has been a convergence in scientific opinion on many of these important issues. So that's being said, I'd just like to say, if I may, I'd like to credit the few of our scientists who've been involved in the writing of this report. Actually, there are three of them, and they're all women. Gemma Narisma, of happy memory, the former director of the Manila Observatory. Dr. Faye Cruz, aside from Dr. Gemma Narisma, there's also Dr. Lau Hamero. So they've been very much engaged in the writing of this report, among other scientists in the world today. What was consoling was when they launched this report last Monday. You said that they dedicated the regional atlas, the regional climate atlas, to Gemma Narisma. Her name was mentioned in this international forum. So I'd like to mention that because it's very consoling to see our own scientists getting involved already in this crucial issue of our time. Okay, so what's the long and short of this long report? I don't think, well, you might have been frightened, but actually for me, it was also a report that gave me hope. Okay? Hope. Why? They painted there are five possible scenarios. You can say that these are what we call emission scenarios, or they call them SSP, shared socioeconomic pathways. It's hard because we cannot really predict how the economies will evolve in the next few decades. But suffice it to say for now that there are five of these scenarios. One is a very low emission scenario, very optimistic. The second is what is called the low. The third is intermediate, high, and very high. what is frightening will be the high and very high, because that when you follow that trajectory, that pathway, then we will breach 2 degrees even by the mid-century. Okay? But there is hope. And I say there is hope. When I say there is hope, it's because I think there is a possibility for us limiting the warming to 2 degrees, especially if we follow the very low and low emission pathways. What are these pathways? Essentially, it's really trying to get to net zero by mid-century or even by the third quarter of the century. If we can bring down our emissions so that, I guess, what we emit is neutralized by what we can absorb, what we can bring down, then there is hope. We can actually still create a safe future, especially for this century. So what needs to be done really, as I said, is policy. What do we do now? Because getting to net zero will not be easy. It will require rewiring a lot of things, not just economies, but even culture. What we eat, how we move goods and services and people, what we produce, etc. So this, I guess, scientists will say, okay, we've told you that this is already what's going to happen. It's up to our decision makers to do their work as well. There will be costs, and so we have to calculate them even now. We have a short runway, which is really this decade, to start effecting these changes that we need to start. So at least we've shown that a 2-degree world is still avoidable. We can still avoid breaching 2 degrees if we follow this trajectory, this decrease in emissions in the next few years. Sorry, I said a lot, but maybe you have other questions.
Yeah, I want to talk about the policy also later, but siguro for now, just to kind of underline the urgency of the situation, I'd like also to bring it back to what the findings were saying about what will now happen, what effects we will feel, because I've also read that we're basically locked in for certain effects already. Like there are certain impacts, certain devastating effects like extreme drought or heat waves that are now unavoidable. And so the question now is more of, are we ready for these? Can we do something about it now? Maybe not in terms of mitigation, but in terms of adapting our lives and or maybe our technology, our governments to this new world we're living in, right? Because like recently we've seen in the US, for example, heat waves that killed hundreds of people in the Pacific Northwest. And we've seen in Europe flooding that we've never seen, like in a first world country, it seemed to me like we were looking at a third world country with all of the, the scenarios where houses are wiped out. I mean, you don't usually see that in the first world, but we were all surprised to see that just a few months back. So given this, like we're in for these effects already, do you think governments are acting quick enough to at least prepare our people for these?
Okay, so now on the predictions, no? If we have, first of all, I think we will probably get to at least 1.5 degrees. We are now about 1.1, 1.07. So we'll probably get to 1.5 degrees. What does that mean? That means actually already, even right now, and we're seeing it, heavy precipitation, heavy rainfall. Extreme events are going to be more frequent and I guess more intense. So that seems to be the conclusion. Also, we see this. There's confidence in these observations and in these forecasts that we have to prepare ourselves for extreme events like heavy rainfall, and we've seen this already, as you said. So I think we've been given previews already. Even last year, we had a preview of what kind of flooding can occur, and sometimes we associate this flooding events with, let's say, a 100-year flood, for instance, something that happens not often, not frequently, but they will be more frequent. So I think right away, if you are a local government or you're a decision maker, then you have to look at your drainage, you have to look at your land use, we have to the way we develop actually. When we were kids, classes were suspended when typhoons were declared, right? Typhoon signals. Now we observe that even if there's just heavy rainfall, classes get postponed because mobility is hampered. And that's that's really because of the heavy rainfall, but at the same time, because of the kind of development that we followed all these years. So I think if you ask me if we're prepared, well, I think some LGUs are better prepared than others, and that's why we have to help some of these local governments also prepare for these climate extremes. Now, that's just for rainfall. What happens if there is drought? The prognosis for the Philippines is in a warmer world. Actually, ganito sa Pilipinas, the average temperature will not rise as much as the global average. So if you're saying 1.5 or even 2 degrees globally, in the Philippines, I guess because of the moderating influence of the ocean, we're surrounded by sea. The increases in temperature will not be as dramatic. The dramatic increases you will see over the continents and over the Arctic, the poles. But that doesn't mean that we should sit back and just relax, right? Because it's not just really temperature. Climate is not just warming, it's not just temperature. It's the changing water patterns, the typhoons, and it has impacts on agriculture. We're looking at agriculture and what they call ecological drought, which looks at soil moisture and evaporation. That's very difficult to study. And I don't think we have enough, actually, people looking at this. And what we're worried about, well, if you ask me what keeps me up, well, not really up the whole night, but at least I worry that in some of our forecasts, in a warmer world for the Philippines, we see a decrease in rainfall. That's going to be uneven. There will be parts that will be drier than the rest. There will be parts that will be really inundated, with lots of rain too. That extreme rainfall will actually increase, but then the mean, the total amount of water coming down from above might decrease and might move elsewhere. Now, if you know that that's going to happen, what do you do? Then you'll have to conserve. You'll have to look at what protects your water supplies, your watersheds. You will not be wasteful. Right now, maybe you say, "Oh, there's a lot of water. I can waste as much as I want," but it's possible in a warmer world that the rain can go elsewhere, and that's why we have to prepare. We're already seeing it now. I mean, if you go to the Visayas in Cebu, water is a big problem, not just because of the climate, but also because of the overdrawing, of water from the underground aquifers. So there are also developmental decisions that we need to consider. In terms of typhoons, we're not seeing an increase or decrease in number of typhoons, but we're seeing an increase in the number of not number, but in the severity, the intensity, the category 4 and 5, the strong typhoons. They will be a common feature in a warmer world. So we need to prepare, because typhoons do not just bring water; they bring a lot of wind, which can damage infrastructure. Let me just say that, I guess, for planning purposes, when we plan, we look at risk. I mean, when you look at risk, you look at not just the average, you look at the outliers, the extremes, diba? some of these extremes are high impact but low likelihood, or they don't occur frequently, but when they do occur, boy, they really cripple you, diba? One Yolanda is enough to cripple the country, diba? Now imagine if this something like a 100-year typhoon, or a typhoon that comes once every 100 years, will now come once every 50 years, or once every 10 years. Some of these precipitation events, or what we call sometimes sea level events, because with typhoons you also have storm surges. When that happens, and you ask, how do we recover? We do recover eventually, but it takes a while. Now you need to prepare. Therefore, you say batten the hatches. We're in a storm, as we are in a storm right now. And what do you do when you're in a storm? You prepare. Well, you endure the storm. That's where you are in right now, but you prepare yourself for the next storm that's coming. And the probabilistic needs to be in.
How about Father, sea level rise? Because we're an archipelago and we have many coastal towns, cities. Did the report say anything about sea level rise in the Philippines?
I was looking for it actually. The report had some things to say about global sea levels rising. No, so sorry, but I'm still rifling through the main one. I just looked at the summary, but in the summary I did not see much. Although I know already, I think the scientists even in the Philippines know that the sea level in the Philippines will be a big concern, mainly because the waters over the archipelago in this particular part of the world are warmer, and warm water means, I guess, warm water expands it. So sea level rises. I have a hunch sea level rises faster than the global average in the Philippines. Now that's exacerbated by land subsidence. Subsidence is when the land sinks because you're drawing a lot of water also. When you draw water from underground, the land also goes down. So these are two factors that work together to inundate our coastal areas. But what the report frighteningly said, well, I don't know, it can be a frightening thing. We're committed to sea level rise. The planet is committed. By that I mean we're going to see sea levels rise, not just in this century, but for centuries to come. Sorry?
That's unavoidable at this point.
Yes, we can just slow it down. We can just slow it down, and hopefully those scenarios will slow. I mean, a low emission scenario will slow down the amount of sea level that's rising. And that means really that has implications on reclamation, right? That has implications on our coastal communities. Although this can play out over a longer time period, not just this century. But we have to prepare, not just as a country, but even as a planet. Sea levels will continue to rise. I think there is agreement in that forecast.
Father, how about our food security? Which crops are the most in danger of being wiped out, or at least maybe being harder to harvest, especially because we're a country that we have many households that depend on agriculture for a living and also for sustenance?
Well, I think I'm not an agriculture person, pero I know that rice, especially rain-fed rice, is threatened. So, in fact, the scenario, if you wish, a dark scenario, which is really not just the loss of rice, but really hunger and malnutrition. in a globally warmer world. And so we really have to take care of where and when we actually plant our rice. So there are some crops that are drought resistant or even flood resistant. Sometimes they call them submarine rice. No? But we need to look at these varieties that will endure these extremes in rainfall and soil moisture. So yun lang naisip ko, no? Yung yung staple, our own staple. And as you know, we cannot even really provide for our own. We have to import rice. But anyhow, that's an economic question. But agriculture will be affected, especially if you have a lot of water stress. By water stress, I mean undersupply and even oversupply.
Father, what you mentioned earlier that we have a very narrow window. You said within the decade to keep within the low emission scenario, which means that we could possibly keep the temperature at 1.5 degree rise. But you were saying that most likely we will in fact exceed this and reach 2 degrees. But we all know that 1.5 degrees is the cap set for us by the Paris Climate Deal. This is the target that all countries are going for, and yet you're saying we're more likely to exceed that. So given that we have this 1 decade chance of a lifetime to save the planet, to save our way of life, what do you think? What does the report say governments should do right now? How much of a drastic cut in emissions are we looking at?
Well, first, let me just say again, the first two pathways, the first two scenarios end up with the temperatures going from about 1.5 to 2 degrees. Okay. In the low emission scenario, you can actually go down to even 1.4. Mean. So there's always this play. But the low emission, the very low emission scenario is optimistic. And that means bringing down emissions to zero, net emissions, by around 2050. If we can bring it down, there's hope. That's when I said there's hope that we can keep it to 1.5. And from 2050 onward, we actually go into negative territory, negative emission. Yeah. Which means that the sinks, like the forests, they're able to bring down this carbon that we've emitted historically since the 1800s. They start collecting them and bringing them down back to Earth. Now, can we do that? Maybe we should. We have from now to 2030, 2040 to try. No, because 2050 yun 2050 yung goal we're now at about 40 billion tons. And so take that down to zero. That's not easy. Like if that means, for example lang, yung kotse. Means you have to at some point change your technology from combustion, fuel combustion engines that burn gasoline to electric. And that means you won't be selling new cars that are fueled by gasoline soon. Soon, this decade. Kasi once you start making now, if you make a car now, 2021, you will use that car naman until maybe 2040 or 2030. And so if you want to really change things, we already have to start in this decade. We can already create those technologies. And it's happening slowly. It's now really economics, market, and policy. Technology also, of course. You're seeing, for example, a move away from coal because renewables are, I guess, cheaper. But there are challenges there too because of storage. But yun nga, if we can apply our intelligence to look at storage, right now storage is expensive, but if we can apply and people are also working 24/7 to get to very efficient storage so that you can actually still provide energy even if the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing, then yeah, we have this decade.
The Philippines submitted its nationally determined contribution last April, and we actually pledged to reduce our emissions by 75% by 2030, but conditional on aid, and only around 3% would be unconditional aid, meaning we won't be relying on aid from the international community to be able to get our emissions at that level. So, do you think we should change this pledge because of the report?
Oh, actually, sorry, I have nothing really. I haven't looked at the NDCs, the NDC of the Philippines in particular, so I don't think I'm in a position to even evaluate what we can and what we should do about it. I must say though that it's quite ambitious for the Philippines to come up with such a goal. But I guess it was because it was contingent on assistance from outside, right? So it's also an acknowledgement that on our own it will be very difficult for us to commit to that amount. Um, Let me just say also that, and I think this is hard to disagree, naman. Our emissions are still a drop in the bucket. It's small compared to the big spenders out there. So if if we will clean up our economy, I think it's a powerful statement from an emerging economy. It's very symbolic that, and it's also prepare. It's also practical. We're preparing ourselves for the time when fossil fuels will no longer be the main fuel. So it's practical. Um, I can see the possibility of coal plants being stranded assets, actually. So you don't want to be saddled with all these coal-fired power plants that you've built, and you cannot even recoup your investment. It will be very difficult. So I think preparing ourselves for a green economy, I think is wise, even now. Um, and it's indigenous. I mean, and I mean, we have a lot of sun uh, and a lot of wind, and it's our own. Uh, why do we have to import, right? Why do we have to get get it from outside? So anyhow, sorry, I cannot really say if the NDC should be changed, should be improved, but I will take a look. I will take a look again.
We live in a country with stark inequalities between the rich and poor. How will climate change, according to the report, widen that rift? Because just imagining this world, like I'm thinking, if we're gonna have more frequent heat waves, then the person who can afford an air conditioning device, right, will be better off. But how about urban poor in rural areas who depend more on agriculture than city folk? I mean, how will this impact the poor in the Philippines?
You said it, Pia, that it's really the risk and the vulnerability of the poor. If you, I like to use this analogy. There is a manhole, and if a rich person falls into that manhole, chances are that person will survive because that person has the connections, has the resources. If a poor person falls into that manhole, or if you wish, get sick with COVID, the probability that that person will die is high, right?
Mm.
Uh, and it's the same manhole, it's the same hazard, it's the it's same catastrophe, kumbaga. So yes, it will increase inequalities, uh, and that's why we want to capacitate, especially those who are most vulnerable. We want to uh, We want to increase their resilience. Those who have resources and connections, well, they will not suffer as much risk. So this increasing risk, which is borne by the poor, will actually be compounded, di ba? You suffer greater risk, which increases your vulnerability, which increases again your risk. So it's like a feedback mechanism. It feeds onto itself, like a positive, positive cycle. So you have to break that cycle. That and as you know, it takes one calamity to break a family. Once you lose a job, tapos, di ba? So yun, we have to provide more opportunities, more connection, so to speak, to those who are disconnected. Because climate it's a matter of justice, really, social justice. Climate will increase those gaps.
The report was just released a few days ago, but I'm sure the government is also reading it. I'm sure they have experts also looking into it. But yun nga, we need also us to highlight the sense of urgency to our policymakers. And like you said, our emissions may be a drop in the bucket, but the impacts that we will feel will be real. And I don't think we should wait for international aid to prepare for these effects. As early as now, what should the government be doing? What are the specific interventions that our government can make to at least help our communities better withstand or prepare for the climate change impacts like drought, heat waves, flooding? I mean, we should be doing this now.
Yes, correct. It requires I guess, statesmanship, leadership to plan beyond your political lifetimes, no? Pero I guess that's for another sermon, for another day. What do we need to do? I think we need to adopt a disaster risk mindset. Risk is foreign to us. I always say it's something abstract. We tend to be cavalier about these storms in our lives. Say, oh, we're resilient naman eh. We'll survive. We'll survive. Pero iba na to eh. I think when when the IPCC says this is unprecedented in the last several thousand years, pag sinabing unprecedented, ibig sabihin, hindi mo to nakita dati pa. Bagong-bago to. And you cannot, there are no words sometimes to describe. I think people are realizing that even in Germany, Canada, they're seeing these things happen. There are no words to describe. It's not within our experience. And therefore, rather, I hope they don't also panic naman, what do we do? We're paralyzed. I think that's why you have to have good leadership. And governance is really key. I've seen politicians who fall because they don't know how to respond to a calamity, and because they've taken it for granted. So that's the first thing. I think we should not take these things for granted. And when we plan our land, when we plan where to put houses and where to put roads, how to take care of our waterways like our rivers, you're also thinking of disasters already. You're not. That means imagining what happens if a Yolanda or a Kiel or the past typhoons last year. What if that happens again this year? That was last October. Yeah, last year. Now, something like that will come again. Now, that's one. That's just when there's a lot of rainfall. But what happens if there is less rainfall? What happens if there's an El Nino or an El Nino type of event, which means that, kasi di ba ang ginagawa na, tumitingin lang tayo sa lamesa dam eh. We just look at these dam levels, bumababa. Di ba? And then we start tightening the faucets, di ba? We say we ration supply. Yeah, we just react from
Mm.
disaster to disaster. I think we should plan farther, a longer time horizon, and that requires a certain kind of leader, uh, who thinks beyond his or her political lifetime. And there are people naman who, and it's not just leaders, but even those who are working in a staff. There are people who are concerned about these things.
We're,
So yun,
I think
ako,
mhm.
sorry.
I
Yeah,
remember
yeah, sorry.
local governments are supposed to have climate change plans in the Philippines.
Yeah,
How far along are we in implementing this? I mean, I also know that these aren't always implemented on the ground, right? These sometimes remain just pieces of paper.
ayun na nga, and magaling tayo sa policies, di ba? And it's also the execution. Um, but yeah, I think for many, climate change is still abstract, di ba? And so we really, part of my work is to just make it real, so that people can actually not just. There's a lot of hand waving when you talk about climate change, di ba? But it's real. It's there. It's already there. So I hope that we will not be so cavalier about these things, about disasters especially. My analogy, it's like it's a lot of the things that you take away ko from reading the report is extremes. We've talked about 1.5 and 2 degrees. Those are just parang markers. They are average. They're averages. What you need to look at are the outliers. This is the mean, yung gitna, yung average. Pero yung titingnan dapat yung nandito sa dulo. My analogy here is, like 37 degrees tayo, di ba? Yung temperature, yung katawan natin. Minsan nilalagyan tayo ng sensor dito. 36.5. Hindi siya pumapalo ng matagal. Kasi nasa 37, 30. Pag nagto 2 degrees ka, o kahit 1.5, di ba sabi, ano na yan, fever na yan eh. And you get a fever, 39 degrees, 2 degrees. Pag nagka-fever ka, siguro ba, how many times? Once a year? Ako nagkaka-fever ako mga once a year. Once or twice a year. So, probability of my getting, kumbaga, is about 1 every 365 days. Now, that's what I'm seeing now. Imagine if the doctor will tell you, because of this, so what you're doing in the future, you'll probably get 5 days out of the usual 365 days na 39 degrees ka. Now, sabihin ko, paano ba yan? Diba? Kung may fever ako, hindi ako nakakapasok. Diba? Kung may sakit ako, dami ko hindi nagagawa. Pero isipin mo, kung madadalas to, the extreme. Diba? Then I'll start to prepare. What should I do if I'm not able to work because of this fever that I'm experiencing? So that's just one analogy of we should take a look at extremes, because the climate change issue will play itself out in the extremes. Some of these extremes are just one-off, like mabilis lang, ilang araw lang, bagyo di ba? Pero pwedeng drought. Pwedeng pang matagalan to. Or, last week or 2 weeks ago, I was in northern Luzon. I was in Baguio, and it was just raining. 20 days. Walang hindi. Sabi ko, ibang klase to. So, buti na lang, Kasi if it's raining, if there's a lot of heavy rainfall, you set yourself up for landslides. And one landslide is enough to destroy your life. So anyway, that kind of a mindset that looks at outliers and does not trivialize these outliers. They may come once in a blue moon, so to speak. Pero in a warmer world, they will probably come more frequently. most probably come more frequently and more intensely.
Last question, Father. We're moving to the election season, 2022. That's what's on everyone's mind. But climate change is something that these leaders have to be thinking about too. So, given this new UN report, what do you want to hear from candidates running in the 2022 elections? What should we be hearing from them aside from the motherhood statements that yes, I care about climate change or I will do something about it? What specific words or promises or policies do you want to hear from them?
Ah. Di ko pa napag-isipan yon, pero offhand, the things that I would like to ask, if I were also in their shoes, what do they, what are their plans, let's say, for local development, especially for um, uh, adaptation, which means really looking at their land cover, um, the land cover of the Philippines and the land cover of various parts of the country. You have to take a look at that, meaning logging. Um, what's your stand uh, on energy? Um, in few decades ago, um, the share of renewables, of clean energy was actually high. Then we started going into coal because I guess that was the low-hanging fruit. And now I think about a fourth only of our energy mix is clean, is renewable. So I'd like to ask the next leader, what do you plan to do about this? Just one fourth of our energy is really clean. And many of these projects are barya lang. So, and they require a massive structural interventions, policy interventions. So what kind of policies should we put in place? No? It's very much like I guess when you ask like Biden for now, what do you plan to do? What's his Green Deal? Would we have something similar in the Philippines? If we look at the environment, okay, because again here for us the environment is very much tied also to social issues. Um, so yun mga tatanungin ko about certain I mean, I will ask them of our potential candidates rather than just, she said, motherhood statements. So what do you plan to do about transport? What do you plan to do about land use? What do you plan to do about even our development, urban development? Where are we going? As I often say, for a country of 100+ million people, you only have really a few major cities, and we're just expanding incrementally. Um, and we need to actually look more closely at the way uh, we plan our urban spaces. By the way, I wanted to add rin, kasi in a globally warmer world, di ba, you can add to the warmth by just building on cement.
Hmm.
Manila is warmer than regions outside. Uh, you can see that even here on campus, Pia. I've been going around sometimes walking or even biking. If you go through that, we have some little forest. It's it's really appreciably cooler.
Hmm.
If you're under a canopy of trees, di ba? But of course, we can have trees also everywhere. We're not here in a city, so but maybe and it's really decisions that were made
Mhm.
by people many years ago. So yeah, I think we hope that our leaders can plant things that will not just be uprooted by the next group of politicians.
Right. We really have a dearth of green spaces in Metro Manila. Like I remember writing a piece related to the pandemic because people want to go outside more often. It's safer. The ventilation is better outside. But we also really lack parks and just greenery. So I think this is also very much related to climate change. Like you said, it could keep our cities at least cooler, and that could help people who, for example, don't have air conditioning in their houses.
Yes, yes. Even the color of your roof can make a difference. No. So anyway, these are some things that we hope, that we can also, contribute in terms of decisions that have to be made. Um, I hope that our academics, those in the universities, can also think ahead. And that's what I think, that's what we are also capacitated to do, to think ahead, um, for others, and to explore possibilities, like, what we can do better. Yeah.
It's a huge problem, and I think everyone should take part in it, in solving it. So thank you so much, Father Jett, for sharing these insights. I think people have a better idea, at least, of what this IPCC report means, especially for our country and for our leaders, especially as we get ready to elect new ones next year. So thank you so much, Father Jett.
You're welcome. Yeah. Salamat din.
And to our viewers, thank you for watching Rappler Talk Newsmaker, again in Pia Renata. Goodbye.